right now, we're not getting more minutes in the day, but we are getting more information. And so what are you actively doing to help your team discriminate between that information, which is noise, and that information, which is important? And I promise you, if you're not doing it intentionally, it's being done unintentionally and probably not to your benefit. The research is really clear here that if you enable and support and protect a toxic employee, it's going to cost you your next 3 top performers. You can fix performance, you cannot fix trust.
So today we're joined by Preston Cline. And before I allow Preston to introduce himself and give us an understanding of who he is and what he does, just wanted to make a really nuanced point here in that this podcast was ultimately created to delve into the minds of those who've created, led, researched, or been a part of world-class teams. And Preston comes extremely highly recommended. And from my understanding, I can't think of many who have researched them more. So not necessarily to introduce you for you, Preston, but if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and giving us an understanding of your journey and the work you currently do.
Sure. My name is Preston Cline, and I am the director of the Mission Critical Team Institute. I'm also a senior fellow at the Wharton School's Leadership and Change Management program, and a visiting scholar at the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative, also at the University of Pennsylvania. And what my research is on is how people learn to navigate uncertainty, especially in immersive environments. And when I say that, I mean 300 seconds or less where the consequence of failure is critical or catastrophic. Why 300 seconds? Because that's how much oxygen you have in your brain right now. And so if you have a critical catastrophic incident, those that are coming to help have about 300 seconds to solve that problem, or it becomes another problem. To answer your question about how did I get here? So how did a guy like me end up a place like this? I was a kid in trouble out of Detroit and ended up being assigned by a judge and a social worker to work with kids. And in that, I found that I was a better human when I was in service to others than when I was focused on myself. And that led me on a path in education, and all my research from Rutgers University to Harvard to Penn has been in education. That's what my degrees are in, my doctorate's in. And it's basically this idea of, if you're going to teach somebody like a young person how to be successful, how to navigate uncertainty, how to manage the various challenges and opportunities that will come their way, how would we go about doing that? And so that's what my research has been in. And since 2007, I've been studying what we call mission critical teams, elite teams in fire, special operations, tactical law enforcement, fire, NASA, medicine, and just looking at how they develop the next generation. And so that's what I think about. That's what I teach on. That's what I publish on.
Yeah, fascinating. There's so many areas, obviously, that we can delve into today. Really excited to discuss all of the work you're currently doing. I guess to kick things off, there might be some listeners who currently are working in the corporate space, far removed from life or death situations where their decision could be the critical factor. What, from your perspective, can ambitious, purpose-driven companies learn from mission-critical teams and the work you do?
So I think it's a really important question. I was just with the Federal Bank of New York yesterday actually talking about this question, because I want you to think about the operational tempo. The teams I work with, they're in immersive environments every single day. That's their job. A corporate person, if they do it well, will only be in that kind of a context once or twice a year, or maybe once or twice in their whole career versus a year. And what I want you to sort of think about is there are sort of 4 variables that we need to think about when we think about corporate environment. What is the problem set, and is it changing? So we think about ordered problems or unordered problems. Those of you familiar with the Cynefin model by Dr. Snowden, these are different problem sets. And if you're dealing with an ordered problem set, probably you don't need to be thinking about the stuff we're talking about. But once there's a crisis, a moment of inflection, an emergence, and you start dealing with unordered problem sets, there's a series of things you need to start thinking about. The first is your human factor. You need to be thinking about how much cognitive diversity you have. How many tools in your toolbox do you have? And have you built trust, cohesion, purpose, and learning in that team? Secondly, technology. Technology is changing all the time. So is your team learning at a rate they need to be learning? And are you supporting that? And then information is this question of right now, we're not getting more minutes in the day, but we are getting more information. And so what are you actively doing to help your team discriminate between that information, which is noise, and that information, which is important? And I promise you, if you're not doing it intentionally, it's being done unintentionally and probably not to your benefit. So those are the major things I sort of think about when it comes to the corporate context.
Yeah, absolutely. And you spoke there about potentially people in the corporate space having one or two of those experiences in their lifetime. I think with what everyone's just gone through and potentially will in the future with the pandemic, it probably has brought home actually how relevant this may be in a world that's becoming exponentially more complex and unpredictable, even within the corporate space.
That's right. And also just to point out, we're talking about teams, and it needs to be mentioned in a corporate environment, a group of people is not a team. An individual is not a team. A team is a team. And so you can't just assume that because you're working with a group of people, we're a team. It's actually quite insulting, right? And so, or you're a community or you're a family. If it's that's the worst kind of a leader, if it's not actively being worked on, those kind of assumptions can be detrimental to morale. And so teamwork, like any relationship, requires work and investment.
Yeah, 100%. I couldn't have said it better. So you've obviously spoken about mission critical teams and how they're often known for their resilience and their ability to thrive in uncertainty, which is your area of expertise. How can corporate teams achieve the same?
So there's not actually a quick or easy answer to that question.
I thought there might not be, yeah.
Yeah, it's so dependent. I will just say this, just pay attention to what you're incentivizing, right? And that's really what it boils down to with corporate environment. If you're incentivizing internal competition, you're going to get internal competition. If you're incentivizing selfishness, you'll get selfishness. If you're incentivizing team goals, you're probably going to get better teams. Not always, but you will. And just to point to people to Adam Grant's research, which is really important. Dr. Adam Grant, he's just coming out with a new book. These are important things to think about. He's an expert on this stuff. And just this idea that one of the mistakes that people make in the corporate environment, which I see all the time, is they are too tolerant of high achieving but toxic personalities. And the research is really clear here that if you enable and support and protect a toxic employee, it's going to cost you your next 3 top performers over time. They will either stop working hard or they will leave. And that research is that's pretty clear out there.
Yeah, definitely. I remember, I think it was Simon Sinek describing the time he'd spent with the US counterpart of who I work with in the UK in my previous role. And he was talking about this matrix where they had trust up one side and, performance down the other. And they said not a single person would even get a look in if they were low trust, but they were more willing to take someone of high trust and moderate performance. And this is obviously all relative any day compared to someone that was high performance and moderate trust.
I am familiar with the research that you're referencing, deeply familiar with it. And I would echo your sentiment, which is you can fix performance, you cannot fix trust.
And I guess off the back of that, you've spoken about psychologically safe environments, but you've also, which I found really interesting, discussed the difference between security and safety and how that links into the ability to thrive in uncertainty. Would you mind expanding on that?
Yeah, absolutely. You're actually touching on one of my passion projects. And so, and I'm going to go deep into the weeds here and bore everybody a little bit, right?
I doubt that.
So the word safe comes from the Latin salvus, and it means free and secure from danger, harm, injury, and risk. And so I'm going to say that again, Henry, but what I want you to do is think about a time in your life, any time in your life, from the moment you're born to right now, where you were objectively free and secure from danger, harm, injury, and risk. Can you name a time? No, right? It's actually a metaphysical impossibility. What it is that safe, before the age of probability theory, safe, the word itself was a prayer. I wish you safe. It was a prayer for your well-being. It was understanding it was up to God, not up to you in the old days. Security, from the Latin securus, means free from anxiety and worry. And so when we talk about psychological safety, if I try to create psychological safety for you, 1, I can't do it. 2, it is hugely presumptuous of me to believe that I would know what my fellow human, female, of a different race, gender, religion, what they would need for them to feel safe. That's hugely presumptuous to me, to do it unilaterally. And so the only way that I'm going to create, because the goal here is to create a forum, an environment, a context in which we can exchange ideas fluidly with people feeling as though they can engage. In that case, you don't actually want to project psychological safety because it's often artificial. What you want to do is co-create psychological security, which is to say, Henry, we need to talk about some serious things. We don't have a lot of time. I actually really need for your voice to be heard, but I actually need to know what might prevent that. And so what are the things I need as a leader to put in place right now to get your full support? And there's a famous story about this, which is one of the professional sports teams was here in the United States in our American Football League was going to go for our Super Bowl, which is our big World Cup. Yeah. And it's a big deal. And the team was really invested, except for there was some doubts about the receptionist. And if you ever see any research, a receptionist in a professional sports team is actually a key position because they greet every single person that comes and goes in that building and can often set the emotional tempo of the day. If they're enthusiastic and up, they bring everybody up. If they're down, they can bring everybody down. And so they had a meeting about it, and they went to the GM and they said, we might need to replace, it was a woman. We might need to replace this woman. The GM was like, whoa, 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 whoa. Like, before we start talking about firing anybody, let me just chat with her and see what's going on. It might just be a conversation. So he goes down to talk to the receptionist. Now, think about this. The GM of a company is a CEO of a company, and the receptionist is the bottom rung, right? And so the GM, the president of the company, shows up at your desk on Monday morning. It's usually not a good thing, right? And so this poor woman is literally shaking. And he's like, whoa, whoa, all good. There's nothing wrong. I just literally want to have a conversation. You're an important part of this organization. And she calms down. He gets her a coffee, serves her food. This is an important thing to understand about leadership, right? Food and water and coffee are love, the expressions of love, true in all cultures. Calms down and says, hey, explains the whole thing. This is what we're trying to do. And she's nodding like, yeah, good for you. Like, you should definitely go after the Super Bowl. And he's like, but we want you involved. And she looks at him with wide eyes and goes, sir, I'll be totally honest with you. I'm a single mother raising 2 kids, and I desperately need this job. I got to keep my kids in school. Philadelphia, I mean, this particular city is a little rough, and it's everything I can do to keep these kids alive and in school. And he was like, so you're worried about getting fired? She's like, I'm terrified. And he was like, here's what we'll do. I'm going to give you, this is a 2-year push. I'm going to give you a 2-year contract, and I'm going to give you a raise right now. She's like, how do I help you get to the Super Bowl? Right? Because what had happened was they just took the time to figure out what was the thing that she needed to calm her down, to invest in the larger goal. And until we aligned her goals with our goals, it was never going to happen. And that's an example of co-constructing psychological security.
Yeah. And when you tell that story as well as you do, you know, the penny drops. And I can look back on periods in my past where, understandably, especially as someone who was thrown into leadership positions at quite a young age, thought I had to be the one that understood how to create these environments, when actually you look at all the successful environments where people feel like they're thriving, they've had an active input in it and they've been heard, they've been listened to. So that makes total sense in regards to developing psychological security, as opposed to this almost conceptual idea that we can make it a safe environment at any point in time,
which we can't. And that's why, you know, to your point, that's why if you look at all great leaders, if you think about great leaders that you've been in places with or done things with, typically, on the majority of them, lead with inquiry. So they start with questions. They don't start with solutions. And usually those folks are the folks that you would work for right now if you were given the opportunity.
Yeah. Without a doubt. You feel valued, don't you? You feel a part of it. It's that sense of belonging. You know, Owen Eastwood's work, it really nails that. Awesome. Thank you for that story. That was really interesting. And then off the back of that, I'd like to delve into another area that I've heard you talk about before, which is this risk or safety paradox. And does this explain why people who feel safer or more secure, should we say, in their team can then lean into more challenge, or is that something different?
Yeah. So I'll give you another parable, right? And so this goes back to my wilderness guiding days. And this is an actual thing. This was a thing called a safety paradox created by the famous philosopher Willie Unsold, who was a great American mountain climber before he passed away. And he was the one who coined the term the safety paradox. And let me describe it to you. Let's imagine, Henry, you and I are leading an expedition through a forest that we have done a little bit of work with, but I have more experience than you do. And you're relatively new. And you're very concerned about making sure you don't blow it. Like your big concern when you're first starting out is don't get a reputation, don't get a nickname, right? You're maintaining your status and your reputation, and reputational management is important when you're young. And we come to a fork in the road, and I've been left many times, and you've been left once. And so you're feeling like confident, like, okay, I know how to take this path, this train. But I say, because I'm more experienced than you are, and I've assessed the group, and I've said, you know what, we're probably better going to the right, even though we don't have the experience. I think together we can navigate that right path. And then you, because you're anxious about your own experience, will say, I don't think we should because I don't think it's safe. Now, the moment you say that out loud, I am now legally, right, on the hook that if I choose to take us right, if I overrule you and anything happens, you're on record to have told me you didn't think it was safe, and I did it anyway, even though you have no data, none, to suggest that that is more or less safe than the other one. It has entirely to do with your own anxiety or insecurity or reputational management. And so we end up taking the left. And this commonly happens in a corporate environment where people who have low risk tolerance because of their own insecurities, as you mentioned, in their own team, will be hesitant to put themselves out there to speak in meetings, to do things, because they don't want a reputation, they don't want a nickname, they don't want to fail. And so they'd rather do the sort of medium effort, they'd rather be mediocre than be amazing, because amazing risks the possibility they might fail. And so when we talk about the safety paradox, we talk about risk tolerance and people navigating uncertainty, you have to have willing conversations as a community about error, about mistakes, and about what happens. And if you don't, what's going to happen is you won't actually see it. But in a bunch of different micro moments throughout the day, people will choose the less hard path.
Yeah. And I think we could probably all say we've experienced that. And
yeah,
as you say, you know, as you become more experienced and you learn these really fundamental truths that you're never going to lead without others contributing, and that actually the most important contribution is not yours.
Yeah,
you got to make those mistakes often. And yeah, as much as I think it's great to know what to do, until you actually make those mistakes yourself, you don't necessarily learn to the nth degree. It's just information, isn't it?
100%. And it's so interesting, right? Because in my work where we're doing hard things, right, and we're going to hard places, there's a certain number of assumptions that go into that. If I take you to Antarctica or to Kilimanjaro or to Patagonia or anywhere, and it's a remote place, there's an understanding from the very beginning that there's some uncertainties. And what's interesting is that in any organization, you know, these things require approvals from different people for a variety of reasons, money, the legal things, right? And invariably, you'll meet somebody who isn't involved directly, who will hit the brakes and say, man, I don't think this is safe. And they won't really have a context. And so I'm like, well, yes, none of it's safe, right? Living in a city isn't safe. So I need you to tell me what you mean, because right now I'm sensing an emotional reaction without the extensive data collection that we've done. I'm not guaranteeing safety by any means, but I'm saying that if we choose to go down this path, we're going to control for the things we can control for, and we're not going to be doing stupid things. We're going to be doing intentional things with thought. Doesn't prevent disasters from happening, but it certainly it requires some intentionality, and I need to know why you're saying something is unsafe. It's just an emotional reaction because you are having a reaction. That's a different problem than the objective, oh man, this is dangerous.
Yeah. And, you know, without getting too philosophical on it, ultimately it's most important that you're understanding people's perceptions, not just the actual reality. And everyone's going to have a different reality, isn't it? So being able to have enough humility to try and understand that empathetic
That's right.
element of leadership.
And that's why the narrative is so important, right? Our way of influencing the story and telling the story is so critical, because that is the way we're going to adjust that.
Definitely. And you've spoken about obviously working with these teams and the expeditions you've done, and high performing teams is such a broad spectrum. But what I'd like to do is to delve into an area that you've spoken about before. I remember when we first spoke in regards to the difference between community and communitas. I'm really interested in this area and how you've explained that ultimately your area of expertise is within communitas, which is different to just creating a community, and how that then relates to ambitious organizations that would like to replicate that.
Sure. So the easiest, first of all, these are anthropological terms. Community refers to, if you think about a team, let's think about a sports team or a professional rugby team or a professional soccer team. You have the leadership, the general manager, the owners. These are folks that not necessarily have played the game, but they pay for it. They hire and fire people. They set standards. They sign contracts. That's the community. That's the people who own, operate, set standards, set goals, that sort of thing. And then there's the communitas. That's the people that have smelled the smoke, that have been through the crucible events, that have been to war and come back together. Those are the folks that have, been injured and recovered and fought on the hard days when they didn't feel well. The communitas is, for a lack of a better term, a tribe, or what in modern terms we call a community of practice. And the difference is between a community and a communitas is that the community, they're in charge of the structure, they're in charge of the rules. The communitas is in charge of the culture, right? And they're in charge of the celebrations and the mournings and the gains and the losses. They're the ones that say, that determine whether or not you're an operator or not. You can't say, oh, I'm an operator. No one says that. That's ridiculous. But only the communitas can say, yep, you're a member of this. Now, why does this matter? It matters for the following scenario. So in anthropology terms, there is a book I'd encourage listeners to read, which is an older book, but it's called A Hero with a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell. And it tells the story of the hero's journey, or the monomyth. And this is the story that George Lucas used to write Star Wars, for example, and it's the template that most movies are made from. The reason this matters is for a couple of reasons, but it talks about this idea of the other world, the extraordinary world. And so when you think about, imagine that you're in a hospital, and imagine that you are standing in the hallway, and then imagine you walk through a door and you're in a trauma surgery. Now, you're on the same floor, same gravity, same building, same air, same lighting, but you're in a different world. Time and space move differently, right? Things have to happen with an urgency. Communication has to happen differently. And so the world between the community and the communitas may be inches, but it's profound. And the way that I describe this to people is, imagine that, you and I, and maybe some of our family members that aren't used to working in that world, we go to take a tour of a hospital, let's say Penn Hospital. And I'm making this up because this is probably not true. But for the sake of this discussion, let's imagine that the CEO of that hospital has a doctorate and an MBA, all in business, because they're running a business. And they're giving us a tour of that hospital. And we go down and we go into the orthopedic trauma section of the hospital, and we turn a corner and we come by a window, and on the other side of that window, orthopedic trauma surgeon is amputating the leg of a 16-year-old girl. Now, all that separates us between us in the hallway and that process of amputating the leg of a 16-year-old girl is a window pane. But what also separates us is years and lifetimes of experience, because that CEO who's only been in business will look at that event and be shocked, as any normal human would be. Shocked, like maybe a little grossed out, maybe a little nauseous, maybe a little alarmed. And they're normally going to be like, oh my gosh, that poor girl and that poor doctor with that trauma. Now, inches away on the other side of that window pane is a trauma surgeon. And that trauma surgeon might have done 3 amputations that week. And they're not actually worried about the amputation because that's the life they chose. And that's the decisions they made, and they're excited and proud of the work they're doing. And the girl on the table, while sad that she's losing her leg, has been fighting cancer for a year and missing out her whole life. And she's the one who chose to amputate the leg so she can go back and have a life. So both people in the room are proud and grateful of the experience, but the people outside the room, inches away, are not, maybe traumatized is too strong a word, but certainly having an allergic reaction. And so the question becomes, whose story is it? And this is why the difference between the community and the communitas really matters. Because a bad day for that trauma surgeon isn't evaluated by that CEO. It's evaluated by the experience of other trauma surgeons, right? And too often, the CEO thinks they understand what that person needs, when in fact they really don't. So that's why those two different things really matter.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And for the first time, when I went into working with the UK Special Forces and the group that I did, I was working alongside people who had such a deep contextual knowledge.
Yes.
And obviously, you were only going to achieve true high performance if you could find a way of communicating that both parties understood. And I guess that's part of the challenge, isn't it? In these organizations where you have someone who hasn't necessarily walked the walk, but has skills and qualities that can benefit the tribe, let's say, how you manage to create a universal language. And that's something that I think I've heard you speak about before in the work you do. Would you mind explaining how you go about doing that?
Sure. And my thinking has evolved about this in the recent years. So there's two things. One, well, let me start with this. What I've started to realize is that in that scenario I just told you about between the CEO and the trauma surgeon, one could make the argument that we need to teach trauma surgeons how to speak business, and we need to teach business people how to speak trauma surgery. However, the reality is that's not realistic, because they're both focused on their jobs. What we actually need when you look at the literature is a guide or a mentor. And I mean this in the anthropological sense, which is to say, if you think about great stories, right? If you think about Gandalf or Neo in the Matrix, or Obi-Wan Kenobi, these characters that have actually lived in both worlds and can travel between them and communicate and help the other team make meaning. So we actually really need guides in these contexts to help cross between those two worlds and help each other make a meaning of it without each world needing to know the language of the other. So that's one, the importance of guides. And I think we're seeing that a lot now with the emergence of coaches and mentors and things like that. The second thing, to your point, is a shared language. So in collaboration with Naval Special Warfare and the Navy SEALs and the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative, we created a thing called the DR5 model. And a DR5 model is a learning diagnostic, which is to say, if somebody's learning a hard thing like trauma resuscitation, and we need them to do it well, and we need to do it well quickly, we need a shared language when they're not doing it well. So instead of saying you suck less, which isn't helpful to anyone, even though they're correct, they do suck and they need to suck less, it's not actually generative. I mean, it doesn't add to their abilities. And so we created this model, which is benchmarked against the processes of the human brain. And DR5 stands for detection, recognition, reaction, response, reset, and reflection. And what all that means is just this. If a candidate, if an applicant, if a novice is working with you and they are not performing in an optimal way, instead of just looking at it and shaking your head and being frustrated, start asking yourself a series of questions in which to diagnose where they are in their learning journey. So are they detecting the threat, or are they just in overwhelm? Well, if they're not detecting it, we have things we can do to help that. Once they detect it, are they recognizing it? Meaning, are they able to differentiate between a cell phone in a hand and a gun in a hand, right? Are they too overwhelmed to be able to do pattern recognition? If that's the case, we know how to fix it. Are they reacting well? Are their hips, knees, elbows, wrists, fingers, are they doing what we need them to do? And then if not, that's operant conditioning. We know how to train really well, actually. We just need reps, correct reps. But then once they do that, they need to respond, which is to say they need to gain cortical authority over their brain so that they can look up and see the entire context. And this is about Socratic learning. It's about principles. It's about dialogue. It's about all these things that we need to understand the principles that are being used in that brain. And then lastly, can you reset, or are you being sabotaged by your inner monologues because you made a mistake, right? You see this in professional sports all the time. You don't make the goal, and all of a sudden every goal after that's terrible because you get inside your own head. So how do you reset? And then lastly, are you learning? Are you reflecting upon what happened and getting better for the next time? And so we say all of that because by giving the instructors that language, that shared language, then we can then be very specific about how to intervene with people's performance.
Definitely. Just hearing you speak about that then really reminds me of the STOP acronym in CBT in regards to stop, take a breath, observe, pull back, process, proceed, and having a framework that then allows people to, in this instance, not like in CBT where you're observing your own behavior, but to observe behavior of others and the forms of communication. And I guess once you've built that in culturally, it then opens up a whole new platform for that communication to be more effective.
That's right. I agree with that. And our message isn't that people need to have orthodoxy and adopt strict rules around us. It really is what you just said, which is a baseline to create a shared language about specific behaviors and phenomena. And once you can do that in a nuanced way, then suddenly you can rapidly assess which of the candidates are going to get to where you need them to get to and which are just probably not. Right? This is probably not where they're going to be successful, and you need to figure out how to help them be successful somewhere else.
Yeah. This leads nicely actually onto the tacit knowledge problem and high-performing teams. Awesome.
So the tacit knowledge transfer problem is something that I spend a majority of my life thinking about. And it's this simple problem, which is the people listening know how to ride a bike. Probably statistically, they know how to ride a bike. But they wouldn't be able to explain it to me. They just wouldn't. If they gave me a bike and I've never ridden before, they're going to fumble around for a while, and then they're finally going to say, well, you just got to get on and pedal. Now, I want you to think about that phenomenon. Bikes have been around for 200 years. There's over 1 billion bicycles on the planet, and they're being taught in every human language on the planet, right? Pretty much. And so why is it that we can do all these amazing things, but we can't teach someone how to ride a bike effectively? And the reason has to do with the way our brains work, the way we learn kinetics, the proprioception, all these other neurological terms about what we have direct access to in our brain. And so what ends up happening with that teacher is what they do is instead of accessing their memories of learning to ride a bike, which they actually can't, and that's a whole nother fascinating conversation. What they do is they play a movie in their head. They're like, well, let me think about how I learned. All right. And then they try to make meaning of it, what some researchers call second loop learning. And then I'm going to try to explain that movie to somebody else. And so that's the tacit knowledge transfer problem. It's how do you explain what right looks and feels like when you don't have proper words? Now, just to put a precise point on this, you might think, wow, that's fascinating. Now let me put it in this context. Your daughter is in trauma surgery, and it's the first day of a resident's job. It's a resident surgeon who's being handed a scalpel. It's their first day. They've left classes, and now they're going to do a thing. And now the tacit knowledge transfer problem becomes your entire universe, because that surgeon's ability to communicate what right feels like to that young person who's holding the scalpel, it could be the difference between whether or not your child is successful out of that surgery or not. And that's happening every day around the world. And so there is actually a massive criticality that we get this right.
Yeah. And hearing you speak about it there, it reminds me a little bit of you're going from being maybe an expert doer or unconscious competence in one area.
That's right. That's
maybe, along with the Peter principle within organizations, you often rise to your level of incompetence. And now you're a mediocre leader or facilitator, and you're almost back to unconscious or conscious incompetence. And a lot of people can probably relate to that within a corporate setting. Bosses who maybe were great at their technical role, but poor at leading or managing. How could you avoid that? Alternatively, how could you fix that within an organization if it's been identified as being something that happens quite frequently?
Well, you're asking a really big and complicated question, which is about 1 billion pieces to, but I will say this. There's a transition that happens in anyone's career where to be successful, for years, what happens is that you have to give the right answer when asked a question. You have to give it immediately, and it has to be correct. And you get in the habit of doing that. Somebody asks a question, and then you have to give the answer, and you have to give it right. And that's your habit, and you're proud of it, and it makes you successful, gives you pride, gives you identity. The moment that you switch your first real leadership job, you have to flip that on its head, which means that every time your subordinates come to you with a question, your habit is going to be give an answer, and you will have failed because that's not your job anymore. That's their job. So you actually have to reply with a question. And the level of excellence that you will achieve as a leader is in direct relation to the quality of your questions. And so instead of spending your time trying to get to the answers of things, you now have to spend your time articulating and crafting the exact right questions that will empower your team to rise above. And so that's the single biggest challenge. And that has everything to do with pride, with ego, with what you're incentivized by, with what your culture says is good, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so the headwinds for you to do that are significant. And by the way, no one's teaching you how to do it. So that's my answer.
Yeah. And it reminds me, I say this quite frequently, and I think I've even got it on the blurb on my website, in that to be a world-class team, you don't need to have all the answers. You simply need to ask the right questions and
that's right.
Repeatedly do that. And
yeah, that's right.
As you said, though, it requires those underpinning values and character qualities to be able to do that. It's very hard, obviously, when the limelight's on you and you're the one who maybe is being seen to be all-knowing and all-encompassing.
It's also one of the phenomenon that you're seeing worldwide with professional sports when you move from college to professional sports. In college and in high school, sports are played as an exploratory development mechanism, and you are encouraged to learn, to grow, and everything else. And you're encouraged to hone your expertise. When you turn professional, the moment you turn your professional, the effort now is to exploit all that work that you've done along the way in order to optimize your performance at any moment. But there's a danger there, because once you do that, once you're just in the realm of exploiting pre-existing knowledge, you're no longer learning. And this is a very fragile place to be. And so what I simply say to a lot of professional sports teams, not that I work with very many of them, I tend to struggle to communicate what we do to those teams, and that's my problem, not theirs, is that you really want a culture of learning, right? And there are many teams that are successful that exemplify this, that we could name a bunch of them, but the ones that don't, the ones that are just in a commercial framework of exploiting and profiting, can usually do well in the short term, but fade in the long term.
Yeah. And understanding what the necessary components are to an environment that creates that continual learning drive, to steal a concept from a colleague and friend, James King, he talks about the sweet spot in that it's when your interests, values, and skills intersect. And
yes,
that's obviously a key part of having an environment of learning. And it's very difficult, I'm sure, to do. We spoke just about the Peter principle then. You're good at your job and you get promoted into an area that you don't necessarily have as much of an interest in, the skill set for, or that aligns with your values. You may not want to be a manager or a leader.
That's right. Yep. And knowing, I talk to people about this all the time, and my team and others, I'd say, hey, look, my job, if you work for me, my job is to develop and support you, but not for just, it's not a zero-sum game. So in other words, I'm not interested in promoting you because you think that's the progression. To your point, there may be that I want to keep you where you are and pay you more. Right. And a lot of companies that learn this, especially tech companies, will find that you might have somebody on the spectrum that's an amazing coder, for example, and you want to keep them, but you don't want to make them a manager. So what you do is you give them another title, leave them in their cubicle, and pay them more money, and just leave them alone, because you don't actually want them to do the thing they're not good at. You've hired them to do the thing they are good at. Yeah,
absolutely. An example that just came to mind then is my partner. She's a clinical psychologist. And, as she's progressed, she's been in directorship roles and leading and managing. And funnily enough, totally opposite to me, she's not interested in helping a team to perform at a higher level, and she just wants to work with patients, and it's taken that promotion and that time within that role for her to realize that. But I wonder how many people are maybe sitting here today thinking, if only I could be in that role I was in maybe a year or two back. And I guess that's on that individual, but it's also on the organization, isn't it, as you said, to ensure they're not just promoting as a incentive as opposed to whether they're still within their sweet spot.
There's so many. It's extraordinary to me. I don't know what, I think it's secondary school or high school might be your secondary school. I'm not sure exactly, but we're talking about 16, 17, 18-year-olds, that age group before they go to college. And what's amazing about that particular world is how many very successful CEOs will take time away from their career to go back to coaching high school sports because they so deeply believe in the development of young people using sports. And it's extraordinary the level of talent that is often done at almost like at a pittance of what they're making other places. And they do it because they so fervently believe in that mechanism. And it's a wonderful thing to see.
Yeah. I mean, when I worked in professional sport before working with the military, we often used to say, me and other colleagues, you find the best coaches in the academy setups. I'm sure, that's not completely true. There's obviously phenomenal coaches who are leading at the top of domestic and international teams, but there's something that pulls these people back, whether it's they're looking for that level of maybe meaning and purpose that we've spoken about, combined with the fact that it's like herding cats, obviously, if you've got a big group of 16-year-olds as opposed to 30 or 46-year-olds. But it's really interesting, and how, albeit busy, but happy they are within those roles that maybe from a status standpoint aren't seen as elite.
100%.
In regards to that, we've spoken there about people potentially moving out of their sweet spot. There'll be a lot of people listening who are purpose-driven CEOs or corporate leaders with a highly ambitious team and mission that really do feel a deep sense of connection to the work they do. My first question for you, having heard your discussions around the third thing or third space, as you put it, is should they be all in? And secondly, would you mind explaining what the third thing is and what are the implications of not having it?
Sure. This work, certainly third thing wasn't created by me. I don't have it relevant nearby, but it was created by other researchers. I've just adopted it. And it came out of research that we did on a subject called residue. And I encourage everybody listening to go to MCTI and just type in MCTI and residue. It's a paper. You can read it. It's free. We have a Teamcast as well. And the reason I'm saying it is because we did it in relation to the special operations world and what, after 15 or 20 years of me working with this team, I got to know many of them. And if you live in that world, sooner or later, you end up burying your friends. Because for some of them, the experiences that they went through catch up with them and they didn't make meaning of them and didn't process them. And so through a complicated, long story involving the actor Tom Hardy and others, very gracious individual, he helped us tremendously with this, wonderful person, Tom. Tom Hardy introduced me to this concept of residue, and we developed it into a mechanism which was a strength-based approach to, instead of saying, hey, why are some of these folks in special operations or fire or medicine at risk for so many things like depression, suicide, divorce, estrangement from their family, all these things, and suicide, why, instead of asking that question, we'll ask a different question, which is, how would we go about if we could redo everything to create an amazing special operations fire mission critical team member who has a long career, who can pursue their happiness, can find contentment, can still be lethal or deadly or expert, do all those things, live in that extraordinary world, and yet still become a grandparent and live a long life with contentment and joy. And so that was the question, how do we do these strengths? And one of the things we found was that for all of these worlds, fire, medicine, all these worlds, if you only have work and family, if you lose one, you're likely to lose the other. And if you lose both, you have nothing, because one of those was your identity, right? And so what we tell people is, after a certain age, and this isn't, keep in mind that when you're in a mission critical team, your first 2 years, you're on fire. All you want to do is get good at what you do. Your passion is off the charts, and you'll work 24 hours a day if they let you. right? And you leave those people alone. Let them just burn themselves out for 2 years because they're having the time of their lives and they're actually enjoying it. I know that sounds crazy, and there's a bunch of mental health people out there saying, Preston, that's terrible. Don't say that. But it really is true. I remember when I was that age, and I remember I work with these young people all the time. Just let them gallop. Let them go like red line and put the pedal all the way to the floor. Accept. After about 18 to 24 months, as a leader, as a mentor, as an elder, you got to grab them by the scruff of the neck and said, okay, you've had your time on the racetrack. Now I need you to start thinking about the marathon, not the sprint. And there's some things I want you to start thinking about right now. Right now, for the last 18 to 24 months, your friends and family have been very kind and patient while you've been head down, learning this life, being part of this culture, joining this tribe. They've been very tolerant for you. However, you've been giving them a little bit of short circuit, right? And so what I need you to do now is I need you to take some of that time, reevaluate your workout schedule, take a look at your diet and exercise, take a look at your sleep cycles, and start taking your family out to some meals or do some things with them on the weekend. I need you to start doing this intentionally. That's one thing I need you to do. Second thing I'd like you to start thinking about is I need you to develop a hobby. And this hobby, this third thing, can involve anything as long as it doesn't involve your family and it doesn't involve work. Now, I'm going to contradict myself here in a second. It can involve your family if it's something like your family learning together. So, for example, one year, my wife and I decided to learn ballroom dancing, and it was both hysterical and amazing because we both had to be beginners together. We had to learn, and no one cared who I was, and no one cared who she was, and we weren't spouses. We were just two idiots trying to learn a skill we've never had before. And it was humorous. It got us together closer. It strengthened our relationship, but it also took all the pressure off. So that's an example where you can do a third thing with your family as long as everybody's a beginner together. But things I'm including are things like, hiking on the weekends, joining an amateur sports league, rugby or soccer or something, creating a new craft like woodworking or metalworking, right? The key is that you need to be a beginner again, and you need to do it with a group of people that actually don't care who you are. They just care that you're a good third baseman on their softball team. And so that's the magic of a third thing. And what we find is if you have that valve to take the pressure off, to put aside this facade that you necessarily need to wear as a spouse and a father and a boss or a coworker, if you put all that aside and just be you, you'll find that your life, it creates a new sense of richness, and in your other areas of your life, you're more engaged and robust.
Yeah. I mean, I can just imagine the amount of people listening to this who've just gone, yeah, totally. And the reason I was smiling from ear to ear when you were talking about the ballroom dancing was because me and two Marines went down and started salsa last year, and it was brilliant, and we were all absolutely useless. Yeah. But it was fantastic. And, albeit it was with people from work, but having said that, I can just totally empathize with the value of it. And now I do something similar in regards to rugby, which was a previous love, starting touch rugby again. And nobody cares. Nobody even knows what each other really do for work or their background, and totally understand this. I guess the challenge is maybe people have to go through, and I certainly felt this, go through one of those areas falling down to realize the importance of it, and how you manage to help people to see the value in it without that is probably something pretty difficult, I'm sure.
So here's where I'm going to be a little controversial. And so right now in education worldwide, there is a big movement to allow children to have as many options as possible, to give them as maximum optionality, to let them grow in the direction they want to grow. And I get that. However, they don't know what they don't know. And we actually, as adults, do. We've been down some of these roads. And it is actually our job from time to time, take some 18-year-old or 22-year-old or 24-year-old and go, listen to me, come here. I get it. You're amazing. I'm not going to try to restrict your destiny. But here's the thing. I'm going to actually I'm going to tell you to do X, Y, and Z for a short period of time. And I'm going to do it. And you're not going to like it. You'll be mad at me. Maybe. But I'm doing it because I promise you that exposure to this skill, experience, whatever, in hindsight, will give you some options you're just not aware of right now. And I'm going to do something on your behalf that you may not like in the short term, but I'm going to do it because by having the experience, it actually gives you some more sustainable habits. So I just encourage listeners with young people on their behalf, not on your behalf, but on their behalf, to occasionally say, hey, we're going to actually tell me in a week's time from now, I'm going to require that you have a habit. Tell me what it is, right? A third thing. Tell me what it is. And they're going to be like, well, I'm kind of busy. And I'm like, it's not a discussion. I'm telling you, you're going to tell me what it is. Or I'm going to pick one for you. Like, that's the way it's going to do it. And we're going to play with this for a month or 6 months. And then you're on your own. But this is the deal. Like, I'm the boss, the parent, whatever it is. This is the deal. This is what we're doing, or there's consequences. And will there be grumbles? Sure. But like, as we all know, in hindsight, the story they'll tell right down the road is how someone who loved them made them do the thing that saved their life. That's the story they'll tell.
Yeah. And, given what you've spoken about in regards to the work that you do with young individuals, I'm sure you see the value that could have potentially brought at a younger stage.
We talk a lot in our world about eldership, and the FDNY, the New York City Fire Department, or Fire Department of New York City, correctly. This is an organization of thousands of people where there is multiple generations that work in the department, and they've been around for 150 years, and they have a concept of eldership, which is sometimes the gray-beard or blue-haired olders, right, need to show up somewhere and either bounce some foreheads off some hard surfaces because people are being idiots and there needs to be consequences, or if you, Henry, you blow it one day publicly, embarrassingly, you get your heart broken or you screw up, their job is to show up, throw their arm around your shoulder and take you for a walk and say, man, that was a disaster, but how do we come back from it, right? And how do I be the grandparent figure that helps you learn through this misery, right? You're not alone. I'm with you. You're still on the team. Yes, it's embarrassing. Man, did it suck. I gotcha. I've been through this before. Let's find a way out of this hole. And I think this idea of eldership, the humanity of it, really matters. My friend, Reverend Sue Phillips, often talks about one of the reasons that the corporate environment is so saddening for so many people is because that we no longer value really authentic community where there's connection, belonging, purpose, and learning. And if you really want a sustainable company, you've actually got to start thinking about the human side of it. And I mean like the deeply human, the existential human side of it.
And especially with the generational changes, I think I posted up the other day just some content in regards to Gen Z are the first generation to prioritize purpose over salary. And I think it was something like 2/3 of millennials are not willing to work for an organization that doesn't have a clear ESG statement. And then also between them, they're going to make up just under 2/3 of our workforce within 2 years by 2025. So even if you don't necessarily believe in eldership, if you just believe in having a company that's actually going to survive the next 5 years, it's really important. You'd hope that it would be the former, but even if it has to be the latter and you communicate it in that way, you're only going to benefit these people's lives who are in these organizations that maybe have never experienced what it's like to truly be part of an organization or a team where you feel communitas, belonging, whatever the terminology is that you use.
So I'm on record for being a massive supporter of the younger generation, and the fact that when I go to teams and they're saying, "Oh, the younger generation," I'm on record by saying that's a terrible excuse. The reality is that if you look at elite teams, which I work with, these mission critical teams, if you look at the generation that is right now, the levels of suicide, divorce, alcoholism, and drug abuse, right, depression and estrangement is so high that if I'm a young person and say, this is what you want me in support of, like, no, you're a train wreck. Why would I want to do that? I don't want to live that life. And they're not wrong. And so we have to actually have a hard look at ourselves. And there's stuff they don't know that we know. Like every child of every generation, they might not know what a hard day's work is. They might not know the power and the benefit of sacrifice for others, right? The true joy. They might not know the intense belonging that comes from shared adversity and overcoming things together and doing difficult things. None of us knew that. We had to be taught that, but we were taught that by people that we admired and looked up to, not people that were like, oh, you younger generations are soft. That's ridiculous. Every younger generation has been soft compared to the generation before. The generation before us were hard people. They won world wars. Like, these are folks that grew up in the Depression, at least my age. You can't tell me that they didn't think we were soft. Oh my God, it's ridiculous. So I'm just a powerful supporter of them, and I'm a powerful sort of advocate of the fact that as elders, it is our responsibility to develop the next generation. And so stop whining about it if you are. That's my message for everybody.
Yeah. And, you're obviously passionate about it, and it's one of our core 3 values, pay it back. That is something that we feel really strongly about, in that we've been really fortunate to experience what it's like to be part of a truly amazing team with that sense of belonging, and also to be able to actually work across a variety of teams and see what the principles are that have allowed that to flourish. And so
that's right.
If I sat on that knowledge and wisdom, I would feel like the biggest fraud or thief that there was. And that's what gives us purpose personally, right, is giving back, is helping others to experience this within a corporate space where I think it needs it even more than sport or the military has that within certain elements. So yeah, I'm totally on board with your message.
Yeah. So right now, where you're talking to me, I'm at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and I am spending this month as a learning director in what they call the Advanced Management Program. And this program, which is sort of this legendary program of all these famous faculty coming to teach, are all these exceptional leaders that are getting ready to step up into the CEO role. So this is the last step up, really, for their career. And what's interesting is you'd think, oh yeah, there's probably a lot of conversations about, business analytics and big data, and there are, but there's just as many conversations about the sustainability and authenticity of you as a human. And this, a Wharton School, which this is the state's sort of conservative organization, it's extraordinary to me about how much energy they put into the development and the sustainment of these individuals as people. And so if Wharton's doing it, man, we should all be doing it.
No, preach. Preston, I think it's clear we could probably go on all day. We've got a lot that we're both passionate about and crosses over. Would you be happy finishing on a word association that I often do with guests? So I'll just read each word out, and then you don't need to think too hard. Whatever word pops up in your head, if you let the viewers and listeners know. So the first word is team.
Myth, right? And I say it that way because too many people think they're on a team without actively creating a team. And so what I'm more interested in not is in team, but in teaming, Amy Edmondson's work. And so that's what I react to.
Nice. Diversity.
Cognitive.
Knowledge.
Wisdom.
Purpose.
Learning.
Sailing.
Oh, love. Like peace. Yeah, peace.
Wisdom.
Hard-earned.
It's 2, but we'll allow it. It's nice.
Thanks.
Culture.
Developed.
Trust.
Investment.
Family.
Critical.
Lovely. That was great.
Yeah.
Preston, thank you so much for your time today. I know people will be listening to this and will be loving what you've been explaining, and there'll be totally new concepts. I know I'm still learning a huge amount from you in so many of these different areas. So thank you very much for your time.
Very, very kind words. Thank you. And thank you for having me on. And I do a lot of work in the UK, and I'm a huge fan of so many of your teams. And there's extraordinary things happening in your country. So much to be proud of. And it's a privilege to be on shows like this and to work with your countrymen. So thank you. Thank you. And is there a link or a website that people would be able to find out more information about yourself? Yeah, if you go to missioncti.com, our teamcast is there. So is our papers. And so our research papers that we write for our various teams, we will, when we can, we will sterilize them and then release them publicly. Awesome. Well, I'll put a link below to some of the different stuff we've discussed today, but also to what you've just given us there. And yeah, I'm sure there'll be a lot of people coming and knocking on your door and asking you a few questions like I have. Thank you.
Hey everyone, so I hope you enjoyed the episode with Preston. There was loads that we covered, ranging from scrutinising what you incentivise within your team to the DR5 model used by the Navy SEALs to train their recruits and leaders. There's 3 things that I'd love to pick out and discuss with you now. The first is the role of the leader not being about possessing the right answers, but instead asking the right questions so the team can find the right answers themselves. This leverages cognitive diversity and collective intelligence. And Preston also spoke about how the type of problem you face determines the way you go about asking questions to help your team find those important answers. And plainly speaking, you can categorize problems into 5 types, which Preston referred to with the Kinefin model by Dr. Snowden. These are simple, complicated, complex, chaotic, and disorder in regards to the different problem types. Whilst the first 2 require common sense to solve, complex, chaotic, and disordered problems require specific, more nuanced approaches. Complex problems are those with a simple cause and effect and can often be seen in retrospect. An example of this might be uncharacteristically low performance from one of your best employees. Rather than being able to proactively understand the underlying reason, it requires supportive questioning and active listening to understand why the individual is struggling after you've spoken to them. Chaotic problems, such as a team who all seem to be in conflict, means it's even harder to understand cause and effect in retrospect due to the number of interrelated factors. The approach with chaotic problems is different to complex, and it involves swiftly acting, sensing, and responding. Now, this doesn't mean the leader must do all the work themselves, but the situation is just too chaotic to make sense of it through deductive reasoning. This requires an approach where the second thing I'd love to discuss is the illusion of safety, or as Preston referred to it, the safety paradox. From the moment we're born, we are never actually safe. Preston therefore states that rather than creating psychological safety, the goal is actually to help people feel secure despite being unsafe. And that is a collaborative process. It involves 3 things. Firstly, we have to have the humility as leaders to accept that we don't know what each individual needs to feel secure. Secondly, we have to have a conversation that uncovers this. And thirdly, we have to create the necessary changes for this to occur. If not, your team aren't going to be operating from a position of psychological security, and they won't be able to perform at their highest level. And the final point that I'd love to share with you and reflect on is the importance of a third space. This refers to an activity or pursuit away from your family, which is the first space, and work, which is the second space, where nobody even knows or cares what you do for a living, and you are totally present when you're doing it. With never-ending family responsibilities and a busy work schedule, it is hard to build or maintain other facets of your identity. But research shows it's crucial in order to sustain high levels of performance long term. So to those of you listening now, what is your third space? How do you stop your job or family becoming your sole identity? So that's it for today. I'd love to express a big thank you to Preston for sharing his knowledge and time, but most importantly, this episode was created for you, and I really hope you enjoyed it. See you soon.